Good morning, guys. Happy Friday. I know it's Friday. What does my shirt say? Ready for Friday. This shirt is worn in honor of Blake, who loves his It's the Weekend shirt. I should have worn it on the wrong day. Okay. So if you remember, shout out to Blake for his great shirts. All right. So if you remember from chapter 8, what we read that the airmen were afraid of engine failure, that it seemed like for every one plane that went into battle that 6 were damaged and people were killed in accidents. So there was more people were killed in plane accidents than actually in battle when they were in aircrafts. So and then they talked about what would happen if people did survive. So the sharks that would get them, the raft that would blow away because it would get off course. And then, of course, the worst thing that nobody wanted to happen was that the Japanese actually catch them if they survived the crash. Okay, so that's where we left off in chapter 8. Chapter 9, if you see it here, is titled 594 Holes. Okay, all right, let's start reading. About 2,500 miles southeast of Hawaii sat a lonely little island called Nauru. The world might have left it alone were it not for what lay under the feet of the grass-skirted natives: phosphate, a central ingredient in armaments. So on this nice little island, it's been left by itself for forever, but the reason why people are fighting over it is it's full of phosphate, which is an ingredient for guns and bombs and all that kind of stuff. Japan slammed onto Nauru in 1942, violently enslaving the locals to mine the phosphate and build a runway. By the spring of 1943, the runway was ready, making Nauru an ideal base for which the Japanese could launch airstrikes. On April 17th, Louis' crew and 22 others were ordered to fly to the Funafuti Atoll, the launch point for a strike against Nauru. So they get sent to this air base at Funafuti, which is another little island, and they're told that they're going to go from there to bomb Nauru. The pre-mission briefing alarmed Louis. They would bomb from only 8,000 feet. That week, they'd practiced bombing from that altitude, and the potential of ground fire to butcher them had worried them. Stanley Pillsbury was spooked by another piece of news. There were about a dozen Zero fighter planes defending Nauru. Zeros had a deservedly fearsome reputation. The prospect of 12 of them scared Pillsbury to death. The next morning, the men walked toward Superman. At 5 a.m., they were airborne. The planes took 6.5 hours to reach Nauru. No one spoke. Superman led the mass of bombers, flying with a plane on each wing. The sun rose and the planes flew into a clear morning. The Japanese would be able to see them coming. Navigator Mitchell broke the silence. They'd be over the island in 15 minutes. In the greenhouse, Louis shivered. So everybody is nervous about this bombing, because not only are they going to have to bomb at 8,000 feet, which is really low to bomb, that means that people could shoot them from below, but also the fact that they've got these 12 Zero fighter planes that will attack, and they're going to be able to be seen because they're attacking in the morning. Superman was the first plane to cross over Nauru. The air was creepily still. Louis' first target, a collection of planes and buildings, appeared below. Louis began lining up on the gleaming plains. And then, all of a sudden, shattering. The sky became a fury of color, sound, and motion as the Japanese gunned skyward. Metal flew everywhere, streaking up from below and raining down from above. Something struck the bomber to Superman's left, and the plane sank as if it were drowning. Then the plane to the right of them fell away. Pillsbury could see the men inside, and his mind briefly registered that they were probably about to die. Superman was alone. Louis kept his focus below, trying to aim for the parked planes. Then there was a tremendous bang and a terrific shudder. A dinner table-sized chunk of Superman's right rudder flew off. Louis lost the target. So they're getting shot at from below. And as Louis is aiming his place to where he's going to drop the bomb, there's this huge crash, and he looks up, and there's this table-sized hole in the plane. While he tried to find the target, the plane rocked as a shell bit a wide hole in the bomb bay. At last, Louis had his aim, and the first bomb spun into their targets. And then Louis lined up on a barracks and a gun battery and watched the bombs crunch in. He had one bomb left to use as he chose. He spotted a shack. The bomb fell, and Louis yelled, "Bombs away!" and turned the valve to close the bomb doors. Suddenly there was a pulse of dazzling light. Louis had made a lucky guess and a perfect drop. The shack that he had dropped the bomb on was a fuel depot, and he had struck it dead center. A giant orb of fire billowed upwards. Phil and Cuppernail pushed Superman full throttle for home. The Zero fighter planes were suddenly all around, spewing bullets and cannon shells that exploded on contact. They flew at the bombers head-on, cannons firing, slicing between planes, so close that Louis could see the pilots' faces. Now, if I were you and I was riding in a plane, I wouldn't want a plane to come close enough to where I could see what the pilot looked like. That's way too close. The Zeros were ravaging Superman. In every part of the plane, the sea and the sky were visible through gaping holes in the bomber's skin. Every moment, the holes multiplied. The plane was gravely wounded, trying to fly up and over onto its back. The pilots needed all their strength to hold it level. So there's so many holes. Think about the Superman. I read that the B-24 could go 330 miles an hour. Imagine that the plane is going 330 miles an hour, but there's holes in it. And so it's trying to flip over. And so the pilots are sitting there having to pull that steering wheel and hold it real tight so that the plane doesn't flip over onto its back. In the greenhouse, Louis saw a Zero dive at Superman's nose. Nose gunner Mitchell and the Zero pilot fired at the same time. Louis felt bullets slashing around him, one just barely missing his face. Then, as the plane sped towards a head-on collision, the Zero pilot jerked. Mitchell had hit him. For a moment, the Zero continued directly at Superman, and then the stricken pilot collapsed on the yoke, forcing the Zero down under the bomber before crashing into the ocean. Superman trembled on. There were still 2 Zeros left circling it. In the top gun, facing backwards, Pillsbury had twin machine guns that could take down a Zero, but the Zeros were below and he couldn't hit them. Feeling a Zero's rounds thumping into Superman's belly, he thought, if he would just come up, I could knock him down. He waited. The plane roared and groaned and shook, and the gunners fired, and he waited. He heard an ear-splitting kabang, 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 and felt a sensation of everything tipping and blowing apart, and excruciating pain. A Zero had sprayed the entire right side of Superman with cannon shells. The first rounds hit the tail, spinning the plane onto its side. Metal shrapnel tore into the leg of the tail gunner Lambert, who hung on as Superman rolled. The plane's twist had saved him. A cannon round struck the spot where his head had been an instant earlier, exploding so close that his goggles shattered. Ahead, shrapnel dropped Brooks and Douglas at the waist guns and Glassman in the belly turret. Finally, a shell blew out the wall of the top turret gun, shooting metal into Pillsbury's leg. Superman bucked crazily on its side and for a moment spiraled out of control. Phil and Cuppernail wrenched it level. Clinging to his gun as shrapnel stuck his leg and the plane spun, Pillsbury shouted the only word that came to mind, "Ow." So out of his 10-person crew, you have Lambert, who's gotten hurt. You've gotten Glassman, Brooks, Douglas, and Pillsbury. All 5, so 5 out of the 10 have been majorly injured in this firefight. Louis heard a scream. When he ran from the nose of the plane, the first thing he saw was Harry Brooks lying on the Bombay catwalk, his torso covered in blood. The Bombay doors were wide open, and Brooks was dangling partway off the catwalk, one hand gripping the catwalk and one leg swinging in the air. He reached towards Louis, a scared expression on his face. Louis grabbed Brooks and pulled him from the catwalk. He could see holes dotting Brooks' jacket, and there was blood in his hair. Louis dragged Brooks into the corner, and Brooks passed out. Louis returned to the Bombay. He remembered turning the valve to close the doors and couldn't understand why they were open. But then he saw it. A slash in the wall, and purple liquid spattered everywhere. The hydraulic fluid lines which controlled the doors had been severed. With the lines broken, Phil would have no hydraulic control of the landing gear of the flaps, which he'd need to slow the plane on landing. And without hydraulics, they had no brakes. So if you've ever ridden in a car, well, everybody's ridden in a car, but hydraulics in a car are for brakes, are for any kind of, like in this plane, it's for brakes, it's for pulling out the landing gear, it's for closing the doors. And so some bullets have gone through the hydraulics in the plane. So they can't close the doors, they can't pull out the landing gear, and they can't use brakes when they land. So how does that sound? Awful. Louis cranked the Bombay door shut and then looked to the rear. Douglas and Lambert were both bloody and were pawing along the floor trying to reach their guns. Louis shouted to the cockpit for help. Phil yelled back that he was losing control of the plane and that he needed Cuppernell. Louis said that it was an emergency. Phil braced himself at the controls, and Cuppernell got up and saw the men in back and ran to them. Louis knelt beside Brooks. Feeling through the gunner's hair, he found 2 holes in his skull. There were 4 large wounds in his back. Louis strapped an oxygen mask to Brooks's face and bandaged his head. He thought about the plane. The gunners were wounded, the plane was shot to heck, and there were 2 Zeros still near. One more pass with those planes, he thought, they will put us down. Louis felt something drip on his shoulder. He glanced up and saw Pillsbury in the top gun, blood streaming from his leg. This is Pillsbury, by the way. That's a picture of him before he got shot, of course, in the gun. So Pillsbury's hanging up above him. He's got blood streaming from his leg. He looked absolutely livid. He was gripping the gun and sweeping his eyes around the sky. His leg dangled below him, his pants shredded and boot blasted. Next to him was a large jagged hole in the side of the plane. Louis tried to doctor Pillsbury's wounds. Pillsbury ignored him. He knew that Zero that had hit him would return and finish the kill, and he had to find it. Suddenly, there was a swoosh of upward motion, a gray shining plane, and a red circle. Pillsbury shouted something unintelligible, and Louis let go of his foot just as Pillsbury whirled his gun around to face the plane. The plane sped directly towards Superman. Pillsbury was terrified. With a flick of the Zero's pilot finger on his cannon trigger, Superman would carry 10 men into the Pacific. Pillsbury could see the pilot who could end his life, the sun illuminating his face, a white scarf coiled around his neck. Pillsbury thought, I have to kill this man. Pillsbury sucked in a sharp breath and fired. He watched the tracers skim away from his gun and punch through the Zero's cockpit. The windshield blew apart and the pilot pitched forward. The Zero faltered like a wounded bird and fell from the sky. The last Zero came up and then dropped. Clarence Douglas, with his high chest and shoulder torn open, had risen to his gun and had brought that plane down. Pillsbury slid into Louis's arms. Louis laid him beside Brooks and eased his boot off. Pillsbury screamed in pain. His left big toe was gone. The toe next to it hung by a string of skin, and portions of his other toes were missing. His lower leg was covered in shrapnel. Shrapnel is cut metal. Louis bandaged Pillsbury up, gave him morphine, and then hurried away to see if they could save the plane. Superman was dying. Its control cables had been cut, one rudder was ruined, fuel was trickling onto the floor, and the hydraulic fluid was sloshing in the bomb bay. Phil couldn't turn it with normal controls, and the plane was pulling extremely upward, trying to flip. It was on the verge of stalling, and it was porpoising up and down. So not only is Phil having to control the plane and hold it real tight on the wheel to keep it from flipping over, but it's also flying like this. It's porpoising. Phil did what he could. Slowing the engines on one side forced the plane to turn. Pushing the plane to high speed eased the porpoising and reduced the risk of stalling. By putting both feet on the yoke and pushing as hard as he could stop the plane from flipping. Funafuti was 5 hours away. So think about it. They have to fly for 5 hours to be safe in this plane that's falling apart. If Superman could carry them that far, they'd have to land without hydraulic control of the landing gear flaps or the brakes. They could work the gear and the flaps with hand pumps, but there was no manual alternative for the brakes. Without brakes coming in fast, they would need 10,000 feet to stop. But Funafuti's runway was only 6,600 feet long, and its end was the rocks and the sea. But Louis had an idea. What if they tied parachutes to the plane and pitched them out the windows at touchdown and pulled the ripcords? No one had ever tried to stop a bomber this way, but it was all they had, and they decided to try. Hours passed. Superman shook and struggled. Brooks gurgled blood. Pillsbury couldn't bear the sound. Brooks opened his eyes and whispered. Louis could put his ear to Brooks's lips, but couldn't understand him. Brooks drifted off. They all knew that they'd probably crash on landing, if not before, but no one spoke of it. 5 hours later, at last, Funafuti appeared. Phil began dropping the plane. They had to slow down. Someone cranked open the bomb bay doors, and the plane, dragging on the air, began to slow. Douglas went to the landing gear pump. He needed 2 hands, one to push the valve and one to work the pump, but he had only one working arm. Pillsbury couldn't stand, but by stretching, he reached the valve. Together, they got the gear down. Mitchell and Louis pumped the flaps down, and Louis and Douglas placed the parachute in each waist window and tied them to the gun mounts. Louis stood between the windows, holding the ripcords. Superman sank towards Funafuti. Pillsbury looked at the airspeed gauge, and it read 110 miles an hour. For a plane without brakes, this was going much too fast. So they try and throw the parachutes out the back to slow the plane down, but it's still going 110 miles an hour with no brakes. For a moment, the landing was perfect, the wheels just kissing the runway. Then a violent gouging sensation. The left tire had been hit and was flat. The plane caught hard and swerved left towards 2 bombers. More out of habit than hope, Cuppernell stomped on the right brake. There was just enough hydraulic fluid left to save them. Superman spun around and stopped, barely missing the bombers. Louis was still gripping the parachute cords. He hadn't had to use them. Oh, so they didn't use the parachutes. In seconds, the plane was swarming with Marines, rushing the injured out. Louis slumped down and surveyed his ruined plane. All of the bombers had returned. Everyone shot up, but none as badly as Superman. Later, the ground crew counted the holes. There were 594 holes in Superman's plane. That evening, Pillsbury was lying in a barracks waiting for treatment when a doctor came in and asked if he knew Harry Brooks. Pillsbury said yes. He didn't make it, the doctor said. Harold Brooks died days before his 23rd birthday. His fiancée, Jeanette, learned he was gone just 9 days before the wedding date that she and Harry had set before he left to go to war. This is Brooks. So one of his crew has died on their flight. All right, guys. Well, I will talk to y'all later. Finish your assignments and have a great weekend. Talk to you later.